Good morning. Welcome to our Unfolding the Word study as we continue our verse-by-verse look through the book of Daniel. We're now in the 11th chapter, nearly finished with the 11th chapter, and therefore nearly finished with the book study itself. We've been looking at this final vision in the book of Daniel that God has given that adds additional detail to some of the aspects of history, the 70 weeks prophecy, and other aspects of history that God has already revealed throughout the book of Daniel. I want to read today verses 35 and 36. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined and purified and made white, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Verse 36, and the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. And then it goes on to tell us more about that particular king. These details in this final prophecy in the book of Daniel help us to understand more about the 70 weeks prophecy. A number of the details that were given so far in chapters 10 and into chapter 11 had to do with the first 69-week period in the 70-week prophecy, that period from the issuing of the edict to rebuild and fortify the walls of Jerusalem until the birth of the Messiah. We've looked at a number of stops, I've called them, along the way. Details about Persia and its future. Details about the coming Greek kingdom under Alexander. Details about the breaking of that kingdom after Alexander's death into the four kingdoms. And then details on how the two of those kingdoms, the Ptolemaic Empire centered in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire centered in Mesopotamia, continued in warfare against one another in lots of ways and lots of reasons for that warfare, but ultimately seeking to control what we call the Holy Land, Israel, Judea, the center of the Jews. We saw a ruler who came under the Seleucid sequence of rulers named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was responsible for a brutal destruction of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. It happened in 167 BC as he, frustrated with the rebelliousness of the Jews and their resistance to his efforts to Hellenize them, turn them into a Greek culture, comes back at a time when they're striving to get independence and destroys and brutalizes them. He died in 164 BC. For a period of time, the Jews continued to struggle for their independence. They had independence in Jerusalem, but they wanted it throughout the region. But at a certain point in time, it became clear they did not have the strength and power to really resist other empires that might want to come in and take them over. So they worked out a relationship with the Seleucids. The Seleucids would appoint a line of kings who would be puppet rulers under the Seleucid Empire, but under those kings, the Jews would have a measure of freedom. These were the Hasmonean kings, and they ruled until 37 BC, even after the Seleucid Empire had been defeated and Rome had come on the scene. But in 37 BC, Rome appointed a new line of kings to oversee that region that the Jews lived in, the Herodian dynasty. Herod the Great, the first of those, and he was the king at the time of the birth of the Lord Jesus. So you see the 69 weeks comes together in that particular way. Now today, in the verses I read to you, I read 35 and 36 expressly for this reason, to underscore the fact that in the unfolding details of this final vision, a time gap exists between verse 35 and verse 36. Verse 35 is concluding some discussion of that period of time during the first 69-week era of the 70 weeks related to Antiochus Epiphanes. But verse 36 shifts us now into the period of the 70th week. You remember there was a time gap in the 70 weeks prophecy, the end of the 69 weeks, and then an indeterminate period of time, the age of the Gentiles, that would end in the Great Tribulation, the 7 years prior to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ to this world. This is now where we're shifting into that 7-year period, that final 70th week of years, the period of the Antichrist. Tribulation, of which the Antiochus Epiphanes years gave some prefiguring of, but nowhere near as broad a scope worldwide now in the 70th week of the prophecy. And so God is now introducing us more to the little horn that was developed for us initially in chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. Remember this description in verses 24 to 26 of chapter 7. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be different from all the former ones. And he shall think to change the times and the law, and his dominion shall be taken away, consumed and destroyed at the end. The little horn is the end times ruler, the Antichrist. He is the one who we've seen now a number of times in the book of Daniel, is the one who is the ultimate culmination of the rebelliousness of fallen mankind, seeking to rule themselves and establish life in opposition to God. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 5, we read about this little horn, this man of lawlessness, this king. And there we find it says, no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come, meaning the day of the Lord's return. And thus the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? No, there's so many scriptures coming together prophetically to underscore for us the inevitability of that 70th week, the inevitability of those tribulation years, and the inevitability of the Antichrist's reign during that period of 7 years, coming out of the renewed Roman Empire, a 10-nation confederacy. Now the question is, as you're reading through chapter 11, how do we know that there was a time shift, a gap, a shift in focus in verse 36, away from the period of Antiochus Epiphanes? And that's a great question, and there's several answers to that. In verses 2 to 35 of chapter 11, the prophetic picture, the events being described, all have been fulfilled. They were all ones that history now shows us actually unfolded in those centuries following the time of Daniel. But starting in verse 36, we encounter a situation where one is being described and events surrounding that one are being described that have not happened yet. We cannot check them off the list in the same way we were able to check off the list issues related to Alexander the Great, issues related to the Seleucid Empire, issues related to Antiochus Epiphanes. So we know that that's part of the reason something is happening here as we get into verse 36. Another of the reasons that we know that is the way that the king, is being described here in verse 36 and in the verses that follow. He's being described in terminology that is also used other places to describe the Antichrist. Terminology that is the same as we encountered back in the 7th chapter where that little horn, the Antichrist, is being described. He's described in terminology that is the same as that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 passage that I read to you. And so we know there's one now being talked about, of which Antiochus Epiphanes was but a prefiguring of, that this is the Antichrist who is to come. Later on, at the beginning of the 12th chapter, we read these words, "The time of trouble such as has never been since there was a nation until that time." Talking about the time of this king that's being described from verses 36 onward, that he was there during a period of time was unprecedented in history, nor would be repeated. Unprecedented struggles, unprecedented crises. Matthew chapter 24, in prophecy about the future, Jesus tells us, starting in verse 21, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. I know the terminology being described here, the events being described, point to no other time than the 70th week and the ruler of the 70th week, who is the Antichrist. Now, join me tomorrow as we continue in our study, and we'll learn more about this 70th week ruler, the opposition of the Antichrist to the people of God and the plans of God. Join me then, won't you? God bless.